Let me take you back to a Saturday morning in June. The year is 1981. London is doing the thing it does best on a day like this, pretending the weather might hold. If you've never stood on the Mall for one of these mornings, picture it. That long, straight avenue of reddish tarmac running dead ahead from Buckingham Palace toward Admiralty Arch. The plane trees on either side heavy and green. Union flags strung up the whole length of it, snapping when the breeze catches them. And people, so many people. Families who'd come up on the early train, children on shoulders. Old soldiers with their medals pinned on straight, standing quiet near the front because they'd learned long ago that the front is where you want to be. It was the 13th of June, Trooping the Color, the Queen's official birthday parade. Now, I want you to hold one image in your head before I tell you what happened, because everything turns on it. A young woman on a horse. Not young by then, I suppose. Elizabeth was in her mid-50s that summer, but she rode like someone half her age, and she rode the way she'd ridden for years. Side saddle, back straight, in the scarlet tunic of a colonel-in-chief. The horse under her was a mare called Burmese, a dark, handsome police horse that had been given to her by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police back in 1969, and that she had ridden down this same avenue every June since. 12 years. The two of them knew each other the way you only know something after 12 years of the same routine. The Queen trusted that horse, and the horse, in its own way, trusted her right back. Keep them both in your mind, the woman and the mare, because in a few minutes, somebody in that crowd is going to try to shatter the whole morning, and it's the two of them, plus one very young soldier you haven't met yet, who are going to decide how the story ends. Let me set the rest of the scene first. The parade itself is a piece of theater that Britain has been performing in one form or another since the 17th century. It marks the sovereign's official birthday, not the real one, mind you. The real one's in April. Someone decided a long time ago that you get better odds on decent weather in June, so June it is. Every year one of the 5 regiments of foot guards troops its color, carries its regimental flag, slow and ceremonial, through the massed ranks. Well over 1,000 soldiers on parade, a couple of hundred horses, around 400 musicians. It is, without exaggeration, the biggest set piece in the entire British ceremonial calendar, and millions watch it on the streets, in the stands at Horse Guards Parade, and on television at home with a cup of tea going cold beside them. That year had a little extra shine on it, too. The Queen was wearing the uniform of the Welsh Guards, and riding in a carriage behind her was a shy young woman the whole country had suddenly fallen for, Lady Diana Spencer, just weeks away from marrying the Prince of Wales. The wedding was all anyone could talk about. The mood on the Mall that morning was, by every account, light, happy. A country in the middle of a love story, out to watch its queen ride by. So the sun's trying its best. The flags are up. The bands are warming the air. And just after 11 o'clock, the procession comes down from the palace and turns toward Horse Guards, the Queen out front on Burmese, the crowd pressing gently against the barriers to get a look. That's the picture, hold it. Now let me tell you about the boy in the crowd. His name was Marcus Sargent. He was 17 years old, and I call him a boy on purpose because that's what he was, not a hardened anything, not a trained killer, just a mixed-up teenager from Folkestone Down in Kent who had gotten it into his head that the fastest way to matter in the world was to do something terrible in front of it. Here's the part that still makes people uneasy when they hear it. Sargent wasn't some stranger to the idea of service. He'd been in the Scouts as a younger lad made patrol leader, even. He joined the Air Training Corps and actually earned himself a marksman's badge. He tried the Royal Marines and lasted about 3 months. Tried the Army and left after 2 days. Tried the police. Tried the fire brigade. Every door he pushed on, for one reason or another, closed. And somewhere in all that rejection, something in him curdled. He'd been paying attention to the wrong things. In the months before that June morning, the world had watched John Lennon get shot dead in New York. It had watched a man shoot President Reagan. It had watched another man shoot the Pope. And what a boy like Sargent took from all of that wasn't horror. It was a lesson, a rotten, backwards lesson, about how quickly the world learns your name if you point a gun at someone famous enough. He'd said as much to a friend around the time of the Reagan shooting. Said he'd like to be the first to take a shot at the Queen. He couldn't get real ammunition for his father's old revolver, so he did the next thing. Through the post, he bought 2 replica revolvers, the kind that can only fire blanks, starting pistols, essentially, the sort of thing used to start a running race. Loud but empty. He even sent a warning letter to Buckingham Palace, some theatrical nonsense about an assassin waiting outside, but the post being the post, it wouldn't arrive until after the whole thing was over. And on the morning of the 13th, he found himself a spot, right down near the front, near the junction where the mall meets Horse Guards, exactly where the Queen would have to pass close by. He waited with the families and the veterans and the children on shoulders. Nobody gave him a second look. Why would they? He was just another face in a happy crowd. I want to slow right down now, because the next part happens in about the time it takes you to read this sentence. The Queen comes past, Burmese at a steady walk, hooves ringing on the tarmac, the crowd leaning in, and Sargent lifts the starting pistol, points it in her direction, and fires. 6 times. Crack, 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 crack. 6 sharp reports, one after another, tearing straight through the middle of that lovely June morning. Now you and I know, with the comfort of hindsight, that those were blanks, that no bullet ever left that gun. But nobody standing on the mall knew that. Not one single soul. Not the mothers who grabbed their children. Not the old soldiers whose bodies remembered a different war entirely. Not the guardsmen on parade, standing at attention in their bearskins, who heard 6 gunshots go off a few feet from their Queen and had absolutely no way of knowing whether she'd just been hit. For a few seconds, and they must have felt like a very long few seconds, the only honest word for what happened on the mall is terror. The cracks cut through the music. The cheering turned to screaming. People couldn't tell where the sound had come from or what it meant. All anybody understood was that shots had been fired, and the Queen was right there, out in the open on a horse. And the horse, Burmese, did what any living creature does when 6 explosions go off beside its head. She bolted in fright, reared, startled, shied hard to the side. 1,200 pounds of frightened animal, suddenly wanting to be anywhere but there, with the Queen of the United Kingdom sitting side saddle on her back. This is the moment, right here. This is the hinge the whole morning swings on. Because what happened next did not come from a security plan. It didn't come from a protocol or a drill or a committee. It came from 2 things, an old woman's hands and a young man's legs. Let me give you the old woman's hands first, because she's the one you'd least expect it from. The Queen did not scream. She did not grab for a guard. She did not do a single one of the things a frightened person does. She had been riding since she was a small girl. She was, by any measure, a genuinely expert horsewoman, and every one of those years came to her aid in that instant. While the crowd came apart around her, she leaned into the panicking mare, took a firmer hold, and started to do the simplest, oldest thing in the world. She spoke to it, patted its neck, steadied it with her hands and her voice the way you'd calm a frightened child, and within a few seconds, a matter of a breath or two, Burmese came back under control, settled, stopped. Think about what that took. She had just heard 6 gunshots aimed at her. She had no idea they were blanks. For all she knew in that moment, someone had just tried to kill her and might be about to try again. And her first act, her instinct, was not to save herself. It was to calm her horse. That's the woman. Now here's the young man. His name was Michael Hills. Trooper Michael Hills of the Blues and Royals, part of the household cavalry. The mounted soldiers who formed the sovereign's escort. And here's the thing I most want you to understand about him. He was nobody special that morning. He wasn't the hero of the parade. He wasn't out front. He was a young serving soldier doing his job in a long line of young serving soldiers, and if the morning had gone the way it was supposed to, you would never have heard his name in your life. But the morning did not go the way it was supposed to. When those 6 shots went off, Hills did not freeze. He did not wait to be told. He didn't stop to work out whether the shots were real, whether it was safe, whether it was his job or somebody else's. He heard gunfire beside his queen, and he moved off his horse and straight into that crowd, toward the sound, toward the danger, toward the exact spot every ordinary instinct in the human body screams at you to run away from. And he found him, found Sargent, grabbed hold of the boy who just fired at the queen and brought him down and pinned him, right there on the mall, in front of the whole horrified crowd. Others piled in, police, more soldiers, the security closing fast now that the spell was broken, but it was the young trooper who got there first. It was Hills who closed the distance while everyone else was still trying to understand what they'd heard. And here's the small, strange, almost sad detail that I can never quite shake. Sargent didn't run, he didn't fight. After the 6 shots, he just stood there, oddly calm in the middle of all that chaos he'd caused, as if the point had never been to escape, as if being caught was the whole idea. When they took hold of him, the thing he said, the thing that tells you everything about the empty little tragedy of it was, "I wanted to be famous. I wanted to be a somebody." 6 blank shots, to be a somebody. Now let me bring the 3 of them back together, because the picture on the mall in the aftermath is one I think about a lot. There's the queen, still up on Burmese, the mare now calm beneath her, the whole thing steadied by her own 2 hands. There's a 17-year-old boy face down on the tarmac with a starting pistol nearby, and his short, stupid dream already collapsing around him. And there's a young trooper, breathing hard, who a moment ago was just part of the scenery, and is now holding the whole situation down with his own body. And here is the part that gives me chills every time. The queen carried on. She did not turn back to the palace. She did not cancel the parade. She did not let the crowd see her shaken. She gathered Burmese and she rode on to Horse Guards Parade, and she carried out the ceremony, the inspection, the salute, the whole ancient business of it, as though nothing had happened at all. She would not give that boy the satisfaction. She would not give fear a single inch of the morning. She rode on. I've watched footage of that day, and what strikes you is how quickly the surface of things closed back over. Within minutes the parade was proceeding. The bands played. The color was trooped. To a viewer at home who'd stepped out to put the kettle on, you might never have known that in the space of about 10 seconds, London had lurched from a birthday party to a possible assassination and back again. But the people who were there knew. The mothers holding their children too tightly knew. The old soldiers knew. And the young man on the ground certainly knew. Let me close part 1 with what became of him, and with one small detail that I think says more about this whole story than anything else. Marcus Sargent was charged under an old law, the Treason Act of 1842. It's a strange piece of legislation, written in another century entirely, and part of what it covers is the act of willfully firing a weapon at or near the sovereign with intent to alarm or distress her. It hadn't been used in living memory. He became the first person in over 80 years to be prosecuted under it. He pleaded guilty. The Lord Chief Justice, sentencing him, said the public's sense of outrage had to be marked, that he had to be punished for the wicked thing he'd done, and gave him 5 years. He served 3. He was barely 20 when he came out, and the first thing he did was change his name and try to disappear into an ordinary life. The exact opposite, in the end, of the fame he'd fired those 6 shots to get. But here's the detail. From prison at some point, Sargent wrote a letter to the Queen, an apology. Whatever was in it, he sent it to the woman he'd terrified on that June morning. She never replied. And I've always found that silence louder than anything she could have written. She had ridden on. She had refused him the morning, refused him the fear he wanted, and now she refused him the reply. He'd wanted more than anything to be a somebody in her eyes, and she simply, quietly would not look. As for Trooper Michael Hills, the young man who moved when everyone else stood still, he was commended for what he did, and rightly so. But I think the truest thing you can say about him is the thing that's easiest to miss. He wasn't chosen for that moment. Nobody pulled him aside beforehand and said, "Today's the day you'll be tested." He was an ordinary soldier on an ordinary duty, and when the terrible thing happened, the training and the character underneath it simply held. That's what these guards are, when you strip away the tourist photographs and the bearskin hats and the jokes about trying to make them laugh. Underneath the ceremony, they are the real thing, fully operational soldiers. And once in a very long while, the ceremony falls away and you get to see it. That's where I'll leave you for now. A queen who calmed her own horse, a soldier who ran the wrong way on purpose, a boy who got exactly the anonymity he never wanted. In part 2, I want to take you further back and further into the palace itself, because that June morning was not the only time the wall between the ordinary world and the royal family came down. There's a story about a man who climbed a drain pipe in the middle of the night, wandered the halls of Buckingham Palace, and ended up sitting on the edge of the Queen's own bed while she reached, again and again, for a telephone that no one answered. But that's for next time. I ended last time with a promise. A man, a drain pipe, and the edge of the Queen's own bed, so let me make good on it. But first I have to tell you something that might surprise you, because it changes how you hear this whole story. The most famous break-in in the history of Buckingham Palace, the one everybody half remembers, the one they made an episode of The Crown about, did not fail because the Queen's guards were careless men. It failed because of something much stranger and much more human than carelessness. It failed because the whole system worked exactly as it was built to work, and the building had simply been built wrong. Hold on to that. We'll come back to it, and it's the part that actually matters. Now, the summer of 1982. I should be honest with you here because I'd rather you trust me than think I'm smoothing things over. If you go looking, you'll find the date of this told two different ways. Some accounts put it in the early hours of the 9th of July, others say March. The reports don't perfectly agree, and I'm not going to pretend to certainty I don't have. What every account does agree on is the where, the who, and the almost unbelievable how, so that's what I'll give you. The man's name was Michael Fagan. He was 31 years old, and he was, in the plainest terms, an ordinary man having a bad year, a decorator by trade, his life coming apart at the seams, his marriage in trouble, drifting. Not a spy, not a terrorist, not a professional anything. Just a troubled man who, in the small hours of a summer morning, decided he was going to get inside Buckingham Palace. And he did. I want you to really sit with how astonishing that is, because familiarity has worn the shock off it. This is Buckingham Palace, the London home of the sovereign, one of the most recognized, most photographed, most theoretically secure buildings on the face of the earth. Cameras, alarms, motion sensors, armed police, a wall of soldiers out front in scarlet and bearskin that the whole world comes to gawp at, and a man in ordinary clothes with no equipment to speak of got over the wall and inside. Here's how, and it's almost insultingly simple. Buckingham Palace, like any enormous old building, has drain pipes. Big, sturdy ones engineered to be strong, bolted to the walls in neat sections so they're easy to install and easy to repair. Every sensible design choice. And every one of those sensible choices was, from Fagan's point of view, a gift. The strength meant the pipe could hold a man's weight. The sections meant it had footholds. Spaced out like the rungs of a ladder somebody had helpfully attached to the side of the palace. He got over the perimeter, got to the wall, and he climbed. Shimmied up a drain pipe to the upper floors, to the level of the royal apartments themselves. And then he was inside, in the private heart of the palace, in the dark, alone. Now here is where it stops being a break-in story and starts being something stranger, because Fagan didn't creep. He didn't dart from shadow to shadow. By the accounts of it, he wandered. He was inside the palace for something like 15 minutes, moving through the private apartments, and nobody stopped him. At one point, and this detail is so odd it has to be true, he ended up in the room that held the royal stamp collection. The king, or in this case the Queen, of England has a famous philatelic collection, and a strange man off the street stood among it in the dark, unbothered. He picked up a glass ashtray, or by some accounts broke a piece of glass, and cut his hand. And then he kept going, and the door he eventually pushed open, the room he finally wandered into, was the bedroom of Queen Elizabeth II. She was asleep, alone. Let me stop the story right there, at the threshold of that door, and answer the question you're already asking. The question everybody asks: where were the guards? And this is the thing I told you to hold on to at the start. Because the answer is not what you'd expect, and it's the whole point. You have to understand how the palace was actually protected at night, which is very different from how it looks by day. In the daytime, the part everyone knows, the soldiers out front in the red tunics, the ones the tourists photograph, that's the overt, visible face of it. But at night the whole thing changes shape. The ceremonial sentries stand down. They go back to the guardroom. And the job of watching the grounds passes to soldiers in ordinary working dress, patrolling quietly, and to the police. The responsibility for the palace has always been split, the army on one side, the Metropolitan Police on the other. And critically, the security of the Queen's actual private rooms was a police matter, not the guards. The men in the bearskins that the world pictures when it thinks, who's protecting the Queen, were never the ones posted at her bedroom door. So the honest answer to where were the guards is, they were where they were supposed to be, doing what they were supposed to do. The failure wasn't a sleeping sentry. The failure was in the seams, in the gaps between the army and the police, between the day system and the night system, between the parts of a security machine that each worked perfectly on their own and had never been properly stitched into one whole. And here's the detail that turns my stomach a little every time. The alarms worked. Fagin's path through the palace reportedly tripped sensors. The system did detect him, did try to raise the flag. But the alarms had cried wolf too many times. False alarm after false alarm, night after night, until the people meant to respond had learned, without ever deciding to, that the alarm probably meant nothing. So when it finally meant everything, it was treated like it meant nothing. The signal fired into a room full of people who'd stopped hearing it. There's a lesson buried in that so universal that people in the computer security world still teach the Fagin break-in to this day, not as a royal anecdote, but as the perfect example of what happens when a system is so noisy that the humans inside it go deaf to their own warnings. But that's a detour. Back to the bedroom. So, a troubled man, bleeding slightly from the hand, is standing in the Queen's bedroom in the small hours of the morning, and the Queen wakes up. Now, I've read a fair few versions of what happened in that room, and I'll tell you plainly that some are more dramatic than the record can support. What the accounts consistently describe is this. She woke to find him there, by some tellings, sitting on the edge of her bed. And whatever went through her mind in that first waking instant, what she did was reach for the bedside telephone and call for help. And no one came. Sit with that. The Queen of the United Kingdom, a stranger in her bedroom, picks up the phone and asks for police assistance, and nothing happens. A few minutes pass. She phones again. Still no one. The most protected woman in the country, and twice she has had to summon help herself, and twice the help has not arrived. What finally broke it, by the most repeated account, was not an alarm or a guard bursting in. It was ordinary human luck. She managed to get the attention of a member of staff, a maid, a footman, someone doing the early morning rounds, and between them they got Fagin moved out of the bedroom and into a nearby pantry. And there, at last, an officer arrived and took him away. No violence, no struggle really, just a strange, quiet, deeply unsettling encounter that should never have been possible at all. I want to be fair to Michael Fagin, because it would be easy to make a monster of him, and he wasn't one. He never harmed the Queen. There's no evidence he ever meant to. He was a man in crisis who did an extraordinary and frightening thing, and the fright of it was real regardless of his intentions, because nobody in that palace, and least of all the woman waking in that bed, could possibly have known in the moment that he meant no harm. That's the cruelty of these breaches. The victim never gets the comfort of the truth until afterwards. In the dark, at 2 or 3 in the morning, a stranger in your room is a stranger in your room. And here's a thing that isn't widely known, which I think deserves saying. This wasn't even the first time the wall around the royal family had come down while they slept. Go back to the Second World War, and there's a smaller, half-forgotten story of the Queen Mother disturbing an army deserter who'd got into her bathroom. Before Fagin, you'd have to reach back to the reign of Queen Victoria to find the private royal apartments breached in quite that way. So this wasn't a modern problem or a lazy guard's problem. It was something older and stubborner. The simple, recurring truth that a determined person and an old building will, every so often, find each other. Let me tell you what changed afterwards, because this is where the guards and the whole architecture of protection actually earned their place in the story. The Fagin break-in was a genuine scandal. It embarrassed the government, it frightened the public, and it forced a hard look at how the sovereign was actually being kept safe. And the changes came. Around-the-clock police presence was introduced outside the royal apartments, the very thing whose absence had let a man wander to the Queen's door. There's a detail I love here from a book by a royal writer named Brian Hoey. When the Queen is in residence, an officer sits outside her room through the whole night. And this is the part that gets me, he said to wear slippers instead of his regulation boots. Not for stealth, for her. So that his packing through the long, quiet hours won't wake her. There's something so tender in that image. The whole vast apparatus of state security, reduced at its very tip to one man in slippers, walking softly so the old woman inside can sleep. That, to me, is the real answer to the whole Fagin story. People remember it as the time security failed. And it did. But what came out the other side of it was a system that finally took the last few feet seriously. The few feet between the door and the bed that no drainpipe should ever be able to reach again. Now, before I close, I want to widen the lens, because I promised you this documentary would be honest about the whole picture. And the honest picture is that the palace has been tested more than once, and not always in ways that were frightening. Some of them were almost absurd. There was a night in 1992 when an intruder got into St. James's Palace. That's the older royal palace just up the road, still very much part of the working royal estate. And this man's great criminal act, once he was inside, was to find the private apartment of Princess Alexandra and help himself to a glass of whiskey. That's it. He broke into a royal palace for a drink. You almost don't know whether to be alarmed or to laugh, and I think the truth is both. There was another man, back in 1990, who got into the palace grounds and when they took hold of him, calmly announced that he was Prince Andrew, that the Queen was, in his words, his mum. He got 3 months for it. He wasn't dangerous so much as lost, another troubled soul who'd wandered too close to the light. I bring these smaller ones up not to make light of the serious business of protecting people, but because they tell you something true. The threat to a royal palace has rarely been the cinematic one, the masked professional, the coordinated raid. Far more often it's been the lone, unwell, unhappy individual, drawn toward the most famous address in the country by something broken inside them. And that, it turns out, is a much harder thing to guard against than a professional. A professional you can predict. A professional has a plan you can anticipate. But how do you write a security protocol for a sad man who just wants a whiskey, or a boy who just wants to be a somebody, or a decorator having the worst year of his life who decides at 2 in the morning to climb a drain pipe? You can't, fully. You can only build the walls higher, put the officer in the slippers outside the door, and hope. And so we arrive back where we always seem to arrive with these stories, at the guards themselves. Because after Fagin and after all the rest, the thing that got quietly strengthened wasn't just the cameras and the sensors. It was the human layer. The patient, unglamorous, wide-awake human presence that no alarm can replace. The soldier walking the grounds in the dark in his working dress, not his ceremonial one. The officer in the slippers. The men and women whose entire job, on any given night, is to be the thing that's there when the technology has cried wolf one time too many. Here's the thought I'll leave you on. We picture the protection of the royal family as something enormous. Bulletproof cars, armed teams, panic rooms behind 18 inches of steel, and those really do exist, by the way, built to survive gas and bombs and to keep the family alive for a week if it ever truly came to that. All of that is real. But the Fagin Night reminds us that the whole towering structure of it can be undone by something small. A drain pipe nobody thought about. An alarm nobody trusted anymore. A gap between two departments that each assumed the other had it covered. And it can be saved by something equally small, a maid on her early rounds, a member of staff who happens to be awake, a frightened woman with the presence of mind to pick up a telephone and pick it up again, and refuse to panic in a dark room with a stranger on the edge of her bed. The Queen calmed a bolting horse with her own hands in Part 1. In Part 2, she kept her head with a stranger in her bedroom and no help coming. I'm starting to think the greatest guard the royal family ever had, across all these stories, might just have been her own nerve. That's where I'll leave Part 2. A drain pipe, an alarm that no one heard, and an officer to this very day walking the night in his slippers so a sleeping monarch is never woken by the sound of her own protection. In Part 3, the last one, I want to take you up onto the roof of Buckingham Palace with a naked American paraglider, out to the front gates with a man who drove a car into them at speed, inside the palace with an undercover reporter who simply applied for a job, and finally up to Windsor on a Christmas morning, where a young man came over the wall with a crossbow and a plan that reached back centuries into that same old treason law we met in Part 1. It's the strangest, widest, and in one case darkest chapter of the lot. But that's for next time. Here we are at the last of it. In Part 1, a boy fired blanks at a queen on horseback, and a young trooper ran the wrong way on purpose. In Part 2, a troubled man climbed a drain pipe and ended up on the edge of her bed while she reached twice for a telephone that didn't answer. Two stories that could not be more different in their weight, one loud and public, one silent and private, and yet the same strange truth ran under both. The threat to the royal family has almost never been the villain from the films. It's been the lost, the unwell, the desperate, and once in a while the plain absurd. Part 3 is where I show you the full range of that. And I mean the full range, because some of what I'm about to tell you is genuinely funny, and one piece of it is as dark as anything in this whole story. I'm going to take you from a naked man drifting down onto the palace roof, to a car smashing through the front gates, to a reporter who beat palace security not with a rope or a drain pipe, but with a job application, and finally up to Windsor Castle on a Christmas morning, to a young man with a crossbow whose story reaches all the way back and grabs hold of the same ancient law we started with. Let's begin with the one that makes people laugh, because you'll need it before the end. The year is 1994, and on an otherwise ordinary day, the staff and guards of Buckingham Palace looked up, and there was a man landing on the roof. Not climbing, not sneaking, landing. He'd come in by paraglider, drifting down out of the London sky and setting himself down on top of the most famous residence in the country. His name was James Miller. He was American, and there's no delicate way to put this, so I won't try. He was naked, completely. I've tried to imagine the moment from the point of view of the guard who first spotted him, and honestly I can't do it justice. You are a trained soldier. You have prepared in some corner of your mind for intruders, for threats, for all the frightening things a person might do. And then you glance up and a nude American gentleman is descending gently onto the roof of Buckingham Palace under a paraglider, and every single scenario you ever rehearsed goes straight out the window. Now here's the thing that I think is quietly to the guard's enormous credit. Nobody shot him. Nobody panicked. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to treat a strange figure appearing on the palace roof as a lethal threat and respond accordingly, and the law, as we'll see, would arguably have allowed for a hard response. But they read the situation for what it was. A stunt. A very strange, very naked stunt, and they handled it as a stunt. Miller was arrested, taken before the courts, fined £200 and deported back across the Atlantic. £200 and a plane ticket home. That was the whole reckoning for landing bare on the Queen's roof. And I tell it to you laughing, but notice the real thing underneath the comedy, the restraint, the judgment, the ability of the men on the ground to tell the difference between a lunatic with a parachute and an actual danger in real time with no warning. That judgment is a kind of discipline too, maybe the hardest kind. It's easy to be brave. It's much harder to be brave and proportionate in the same half-second. Hold that idea, proportion, because the very next story tests it in the opposite direction. The following year, 1995, this time there's nothing funny about it and nothing gentle. A student named John Gillard drove a car straight at the gates of Buckingham Palace. Not slowly, not as a protest you could talk down. He rammed the gates at something like 50 miles an hour, 80 kilometers an hour, and hit them with enough force to tear one of them clean off its hinges. Picture that. The great ornamental gates of the palace, the ones 1,000 tourists photograph every single day, and a car comes screaming up and smashes into them hard enough to rip iron off the mountings. That is a violent act. That is a machine used as a weapon against the sovereign's home. And the response to it could not have been more different from the paraglider, and rightly so, because this was not a naked man drifting down for attention. This was force at speed, aimed at the gates. I put these two side by side on purpose, the paraglider and the car, because together they tell you what the job of guarding the palace actually is when you strip the ceremony away. It is not standing still and looking impressive. It is making, over and over, the hardest call there is. What is this, and how much response does it deserve? Too little and a real threat gets through. Too much, and you've badly hurt a harmless fool who came down out of the sky for a laugh. The guards got both of those calls right in the same decade under no warning at all. We remember the outfits. We forget the judgment. The judgment is the whole thing. Now let me show you the cleverest breach of the lot, and the one that should frighten you most, precisely because there was no drain pipe, no car, no parachute, no forced entry at all. The year is 2003, and a man named Ryan Perry got deeper inside the working life of Buckingham Palace than Fagin, than any of them, and he did it by filling in an application form. Perry was a reporter for a newspaper, and he wanted to test, really test, how secure the palace was, so he didn't climb anything. He applied for a job. A footman's job, staff, household, the people who move through the private areas as a matter of routine. And using a false reference, he got it. He was hired. He worked inside Buckingham Palace as a member of staff for around 2 months. And here is the part that turns it from an embarrassing anecdote into something serious. This was not a quiet stretch. During Perry's time inside, the palace was hosting a state visit from the President of the United States, George W. Bush, with what was described as unprecedented security wrapped around the whole event. And a man with a fake reference and a hidden purpose was on the inside of it the entire time, walking the halls with a legitimate staff pass, invisible because he'd come through the front door the honest way. Perry himself said afterward, and this is the line that should stay with you, that had he been a terrorist intent on harming the Queen or the visiting American president, he could have done it with absolute ease. Sit with that, because it's the deepest lesson in this entire 3-part story. Everything else we've talked about, the guards, the alarms, the cameras, the officer in the slippers, the panic rooms behind 18 inches of steel, all of it is built to keep the outside out. To stop the man on the drain pipe, the car at the gate, the figure on the roof. But Ryan Perry didn't attack the wall. He got the wall to let him in. He proved that the most sophisticated perimeter in the world means nothing if a false reference on a job form can walk straight past it. The threat, it turned out, could wear a staff uniform and carry a tea tray. The palace tightened its vetting hard after that. Background checks, references, The whole hearing machinery around the royal household got a great deal more suspicious. And thank goodness it did. But Perry's 2 months are the reason a whole category of security exists now that has nothing to do with soldiers or gates. Some walls, it turns out, have to be built inside the hearing office. I've got one more of the strange ones before we get to the dark heart of part 3, and this one lands somewhere between the funny and the serious. The year is 2004. A member of a campaign group called Fathers for Justice, a protest movement about fathers' access to their children, climbed up onto the front of Buckingham Palace and got himself onto the ledge, the parapet, right by the famous balcony. The one the royal family steps out onto to wave at the crowds. And there he stayed, for 5.5 hours. 5.5 hours on the front of Buckingham Palace, in full view of the whole world, dressed of all things in a costume. It was a protest, and a spectacular one, and it worked in the sense that everybody saw it. The Queen wasn't in residence at the time, so there was no immediate danger to her person. And this is why it wasn't just theater, it lit a fire under a very serious fear. Because if a protester in a costume could get up there and stay for 5.5 hours, then the question wrote itself. What if it hadn't been a protester? What if someone had got to that same spot with something far worse than a placard? The incident raised real alarm about the possibility of a terrorist attack on the palace, and it fed directly into calls for the army to take a bigger hand in the overall security of the royal family, rather than leaving the seams between army and police that we saw swallow the Fagan alarm 20 years before. So even the theatrical one wasn't just theater. Every one of these, the roof, the gates, the reporter, the balcony, pushed the whole system to close another gap. That's the quiet story running under all the noise. Each breach, however absurd, made the next one harder. And now I have to take you somewhere that isn't absurd at all, because I want to end this documentary by showing you that these stories are not all safely in the past. The most recent one I'm going to tell you is genuinely dark, and it closes a loop that opened in part 1 in a way that gave me chills when I first understood it. Move forward to Christmas Day. Windsor Castle, not Buckingham Palace this time, but Windsor, the ancient royal residence out west of London, where the family so often gathers for Christmas. A young man named Jaswant Singh Chahal, 21 years old, came over the perimeter of the castle. He'd scaled it using a rope ladder, nylon, homemade, the kind of quiet, determined preparation that tells you this was no spur-of-the-moment thing. And he was inside the grounds of Windsor Castle for around 2 hours before officers confronted him and brought him down with tasers. He was carrying a crossbow. And his stated purpose, the thing he had come there on Christmas morning to do, was to kill the Queen. There's no comedy anywhere in this one. This was not a man wanting a whiskey or a boy wanting to be famous. This was a young person who had genuinely planned to assassinate the monarch, who had armed himself for it, who had breached the grounds of one of the family's most private homes on the most family-scented day of the year, and who got 2 hours inside before he was stopped. 2 hours. The same haunting echo as Fagan's 15 minutes and the paraglider's silent descent. The gap between getting in and getting caught is always the terrifying part, and here it was 2 whole hours with a loaded weapon. He was stopped. That matters more than anything else in the sentence, so let me say it plainly. He was stopped before he ever got near her, by the people whose entire job is to be there for exactly this. The system that had failed so badly on the Fagan night in 1982 caught Jaswant Singh Chahal in the Windsor grounds decades later. That is what 40 years of learning from every drainpipe and every gate and every false alarm actually buys you. It buys the 2 hours ending the right way. And here's the loop closing, the thing that made the hair stand up on my arms. Chahal was prosecuted for treason, under the Treason Act, the old law, the same family of law we met in part 1, the one that hadn't been dusted off in over 80 years until a boy named Marcus Sargent fired 6 blanks on the Mall in 1981. From that June morning to a Christmas at Windsor decades later, the same ancient statute, written to protect the sovereign's person, reached across all that time and closed its hand on another young man who'd raised a weapon at the crown. He was sent to prison for it, held under conditions that reflected both the gravity of what he'd tried to do and the state of his mind when he did it. Two young men, two weapons, one that could only fire blanks, one that could kill, two very different decades, and the same law and the same sad, recurring truth underneath. The person most likely to come for the crown has almost always been a young man in some kind of private crisis, drawn toward the brightest light in the country by something dark inside himself. So let me pull all three parts together now, because we've come a long way and I want to give you the thread that runs through the whole thing. Look at everyone we've met. Sergeant, 17, wanting to be a somebody. Fagin, 31, his life in pieces. The naked man from the sky. The student who rammed the gates. The reporter who wore a staff uniform. The protester on the balcony for 5.5 hours. Chael, 21, with a crossbow and a plan. Not one of them was the professional threat we all imagine when we picture danger to the royal family. Every single one was an individual, often a young one, often an unwell or unhappy one, acting more or less alone, and each one exposing a different seam in the wall. And look at what caught them over and over. Not in the end the ceremony, not the bearskin hats and the still faces that the tourists try so hard to make laugh. Those are the symbol of the protection, not the substance of it. What actually caught these people, again and again, was the substance underneath. The young trooper who moved when everyone else froze, the maid on her early rounds, the officer in the slippers who wasn't there in 1982 and is there every night now, the soldiers at Windsor who ended those 2 hours the right way, and the newer, invisible guards nobody pictures at all, the vetting officer in the hearing room who now reads a job application from a footman and asks the second question that nobody asked Ryan Perry. That, in the end, is what this whole documentary has really been about. We look at the Royal Guard and we see a photograph, a costume, a tourist attraction, something that stands very still and doesn't react no matter what you do in front of it. And that stillness is real and it's a discipline in its own right. But underneath it, the thing the stillness is protecting is something entirely alive. Fully operational soldiers, alert police. Awake human beings through every long quiet night whose ordinary presence is the actual wall. The technology cries wolf. The gates can be rammed. The reference can be faked. In the last few feet, it always comes down to a person who is paying attention when it matters. I began all of this, back in part 1, with a queen who calmed her own bolting horse with her bare hands rather than let a boy have the fear he'd come for. And I said at the end of part 2 that I was starting to think the greatest guard the royal family ever had might have been her own nerve. 3 parts in, I'm sure of it, but I'd add one thing now. Her nerve was never alone. Behind it, around it, through every one of these stories, there was always someone else awake in the dark. A trooper, a maid, an officer in slippers, a soldier on a castle wall on Christmas morning. That's who the Royal Guard really is, not the photograph out front. The one you never see, who's there anyway. That's where I'll leave all 3 parts. Thank you for staying with it to the end. Every name, every date, every strange and human moment of it was real.